welcome. You're watching Bloomberg Quint. Now, is it a transport company? Is it a tech company? Is it a taxi aggregator? Well, it's a big setback for Uber. The European Union's top court, the ECJ, has ruled that Uber should be regulated as a transport company and not a digital service company. The decision from the ECJ clarifies that connecting people via an application to non-professional drivers forms an integral part of a transport service. Uber has argued that it is a tech platform connecting passengers with independent drivers. Now, the ruling is significant and is being watched by the tech industry as it could dictate how firms may be regulated across the EU in the future. Now, Stephanie Budoni of Bloomberg News joins us from Luxembourg. Stephanie, thanks so much for joining us on Bloomberg Quint. You've been tracking all developments from the court all day. I want to start off by asking you what this really means, this verdict really means for other tech companies and Uber, of course, and what really transpired in court today.
Sure. Well, as you said it already, this is a decision by the EU's highest court, so it clarifies for the first time, really. I mean, it's a precedent-setting case that clarifies for the first time that an app like Uber should be regulated like a transport company. This rejects the view that Uber has been holding on to throughout this whole court process, which has been going on for a couple of years here in the EU court, that it is really just a digital service. Uber has been saying that an electronic intermediation, as its app is a service in itself, and it's separate from the final service. Now, the EU's top court today, in its ruling, which is binding across the 28-nation EU, rejects this view and says that the application is an integral part of the whole service that it offers and therefore should be regulated as a transport service.
Right, Stephanie, but does this really indicate how courts and regulators around the world have been struggling to understand the business models of tech companies like Uber? Did any of those observations or arguments made in court today?
I think for me what really came out of this ruling is that the EU regulation has not really come up to speed with this new gig economy. And the court did what it could under current EU laws. And the court quite clearly in its ruling did say, as current EU laws stand, this has to be regulated by national rules and the transport rules. But I think the ruling really wider, shows that there needs to be some common EU-wide regulation or rule that helps clarify what the situation is with the wider gig economy. Now, obviously, there's also other companies like Airbnb and Deliveroo and so on. And I think this ruling today clarifies that while it doesn't concern these services directly, it does clarify that a lot of these services are more than just an app. And I think, let's see what happens now.
Stephanie, it's interesting you say that because it might have wider ramifications for the gig economy, but we did reach out to Uber, and Uber's statement categorically was that this ruling will not change things in most EU countries where we already operate under transportation law. However, millions of Europeans are still prevented from using apps like ours. As our new CEO said, it is appropriate to regulate services such as Uber, and so we will continue the dialogue with cities across Europe. This is the approach we will take to ensure everyone can get a reliable ride at the tap of a button. It's interesting. It also becomes interesting, Stephanie, because of course, Uber's had its fair share of legal troubles and regulatory troubles in London as well, because London being a key market for the tech giant, well, it seems to be interesting that now there's a development when it comes to the ECJ on the whole. But also in London, even after its appeal, it doesn't look like it's a very positive picture for Uber.
I think concerning the issue that is at stake in this case, where we got a ruling today, it's quite clear that this now sets a precedent across the 28-nation EU for how an app such as Uber should be regulated. Now, what shouldn't be forgotten, though, and that's important to mention, is that the specific ECJ case did center around Uber Pop, which is a service that Uber has been phasing out across the EU for over various regulatory issues because it was an inexpensive ride-hailing service that allowed drivers without a taxi license to use their own cars and to pick up passengers. The ruling specifically addresses services like that. But because it clarifies for the first time that Uber is more than just an app, I think that's really the key in this ruling today. And therefore, it could have some kinds of effects on national disputes like you have in the UK, for instance. Mm-hmm. There are ongoing cases going on there, also over how drivers for Uber should be treated. Now, obviously, today's ruling won't have a direct effect on that.
Right.
But it could have a wider effect to some extent because it rejects Uber's view that it is just a digital company. No, it is more than just an app.
Right, Stephanie, you've been tracking this all day in court. Thank you so much for actually speaking with us here at Bloomberg Quint. Now, just to discuss this further, we're also joined by Professor Andrea Spicer, Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Cass Business School, University of London. Mr. Spicer, really appreciate you joining us as well. You were tuned in to the conversation right now. I just wanted to get, the details from court and, really to elaborate on some of them and to get your take now on what the implications of such a ruling could be for Uber and tech companies across Europe.
I think the number one suggestion here is that Uber is not a tech company. It's a taxi company. It's in the transportation business rather than the tech business. Now, this is a very important ruling because it suggests that Uber is not able to kind of begin to avoid regulation like many it has in the past. Uber's major business model has been attempting to kind of avoid or skirt around regulation, which has been in the transportation industry. Instead of doing that, it's had to sort of pull back and had to sort of begin to comply with the same kinds of rulings which transportation companies have to comply with. Now, this has a bigger implication beyond Uber to other kinds of industries like Airbnb, Deliveroo, etc. We no longer can say Airbnb is just a app which helps you to get in contact with people who own accommodation. It puts it more into the space of being a hotel company, which then means a whole set of laws begin to apply to it. And this is going to have broader knock-on effects.
Absolutely, Mrs. Spicer, but it becomes even more interesting considering, the cause of action in this particular case at the European Court of Justice was, of course, with the Barcelona Taxi Drivers Association, who actually wanted to prevent Uber from setting up in the Spanish city. It's impossible to actually, get an Uber, of course, out there because Uber doesn't ply in that part of the world. The taxi drivers actually said that Uber drivers should have authorizations, licenses, and accused the company of engaging in unfair competition. Now, this is an argument which is playing out all over the world. It's happening here in India, in Mumbai, in Delhi, all over the world. There seem to be taxi associations who seem to be irate by Uber's business model. So you mentioned what this means for the gig economy on the whole with Airbnb and Deliveroo. But when it comes to, this, taxi association versus internet company debate, this could mean, Uber could be reassessing a lot of things themselves because this is a battle playing out all over the world.
Indeed. So Uber previously had faced less sort of opposition. It's been basically pushing forward its model. But over the last few years, taxi associations plus regulators across the world are beginning to push back on Uber and say, hey, you haven't got a free rein here. The rules which apply to other people also apply to you. Now, what this means is that it looks like Uber is going to be facing far more of a patchwork of regulations across the world, Europe and the world, and they'll be able to operate in some cities, but there'll be other cities where it's just not worth their while to operate in, such as Copenhagen, where they've pulled out. If you go to Paris, what you find there is that taxi drivers actually have a range of apps going at once. So the taxi drivers are able to then pick between, do I take a normal passenger, do I take an Uber passenger, or something else? That gives choice both for the taxi drivers but also for the customers as well. Now, this begins to point out the big danger with Uber is that it would basically create a kind of a global monopoly for taxi services, like it would be the only app available, which was great for the company. But as we know, having a monopoly is potentially not so good for consumers and also for the people who have to work for that company. So maybe one of the implications here will be that we see a kind of patchwork of different apps beginning to appear throughout Europe and other kinds of business models. So, for instance, when Uber pulled out of Austin in the US, following some sort of local rulings, what happened is some of the taxi drivers in Austin got together and created their own kind of co-op owner driver-owned app. Now, the advantage for them is that Uber currently takes around about 25% off the driver once the fare is done. Now, they would charge a far smaller percentage, which was certainly better for the driver in some ways.
Do you know, Mr. Spicer, I mean, I'd have to play devil's advocate over here because whilst there is an argument against companies like Uber and their business models, in these situations, like you mentioned in Europe, it's kind of fascinating because what Uber has done has been disruptive in its space as well, because essentially a lot of these companies were charging a lot more, traditional taxi companies. With Uber coming in, well, things have become cheaper, more convenient for customers. Is that an argument that can be made as well?
Sure. So here in London, customers love using the Uber app. It's simple, it's easy. It's also driven innovation in other parts of the industry. But we have to remember it wasn't just Uber doing this. There were a range of companies who were kind of offering this solution. Now, Uber managed to get ahead because, as many of the viewers will know, Uber has been losing money hand over fist. Basically, it's an operation where venture capitalists keep on putting money in the hope that they'll create huge growth rates as customers pick it up and say this is a great service. It's only a great service because it's essentially being subsidized by venture capital money in the hope that they'll be able to then sell on the business to shareholders. And then it's the problem of shareholders to work out how to make it profitable. In the short term, that would probably mean a worse deal for both customers and drivers. In the medium term, they might be able to fix that problem through self-driving cars, but that's some way off yet.
You know, Mrs. Spicer, it's an interesting phenomenon, especially what's happening in the European Union and Europe per se, because it seems to be, be it competition regulators, be it, the European Court of Justice, be it, the taxman, everyone seems to be going after tech companies for things that perhaps they think are illegal in those jurisdictions where tech companies are using different cities and different jurisdictions in Europe, either to avoid tax or to save tax or to come up with a model which would perhaps disrupt the space. Is the EU, according to you, taking the lead when it comes to really taking on these tech giants?
Well, if you look across the world, if you take a global picture, the US has been fairly lax on these tech giants. Europe is being harder, but if you look in other spaces such as China, essentially many of the tech giants which operate in China are extensions of the government. So in many ways, they're very tightly regulated. So if we take a global picture, actually the major aberration is the US, which has let these kind of its own tech companies do as it will. Europe is playing catch up, where it's given basically the tech companies a bit of a free ticket for so long. And now they're beginning to say, hey, you guys need to play by the rules that everyone else plays with. Yes, as your reporter pointed out, we might need to adjust those rules to take into account some aspects of a new service. But I sort of doubt how much real disruption there is by just adding a kind of get your ride using an app rather than ringing them up on the phone. I mean, sometimes I think our talk about innovation runs far ahead of the actual innovation which is happening with these companies. And sometimes, yes, there's needs for some degrees of change in regulation, but wholesale saying that no regulation applies, I think, is also pushing it too far.
Right, Mr. Spicer, that's an interesting point. but also considering what's happening in Europe and how Europe's really been pitching to encourage innovation and obviously to help European entrepreneurs compete with American and Asian rivals, and everyone's been vying for those businesses. Does this send out a mixed message? Because whilst a lot of member nations or local governments will be pitching and trying to attract that investment or trying to get companies to set up shop in those particular cities or countries, when the regulators are actually coming out then clamping down on these companies, does that augur well for countries in the EU?
So we have to remember Uber is not a tiny startup. It's a massive multi-billion dollar company, and simply asking them to play by the rules that others play by is, I think, a fairly reasonable kind of thing. You raise the problem of Europe attracting, creating startups. In some ways, by letting one company dominate the startup space, it has the problem of crowding out the possibility for innovation in other cases. So my suggestion is that this Uber ruling will actually do more for innovation in Europe potentially, because it will create space for a lot of local innovations in terms of different different forms of ride-hailing apps. And out of that, you're more likely to get a range of different ways of calling a cab rather than one large American company dominating the space. I think what will happen is that some of the US companies, all of the big tech companies are realizing, okay, now we have to begin to deal with regulation, and they're beginning to adjust their business model precisely. But we have to remember that they've been able to operate in a space without the same kind of regulations that other industries have.
Mr. Spicer, I really appreciate you joining us from London. Those are some fascinating insights, and well, it remains to be seen what this ruling means for Uber and other companies, tech companies per se. All of you watching, thanks so much for tuning in. Stay tuned to Bloomberg Quint.